Morning and welcome to the first meeting of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee in 2026, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome members back after the break, which I hope was a restful one, and to welcome our witnesses here today who are going to give us evidence about the community side of our inquiry into GB Energy and net zero transition. If I could ask the panellists in the first panel, both those in the room and Neil Mackinnon, who's not in the room, to just briefly give us their names and their job titles, that would be very helpful. So we'll start with Neil.
Good morning.
Morning, Neil. So would you like to just give us your full name and your job title, please?
Neil Mackinnon, Development Manager, Galson Estate Trust in Lewis.
Thank you.
Good morning and Happy New Year to the committee. My name is Roseweir. I'm Chair of the Fort Seafield Wallacetown Community Association, a registered charity. I'm also a Community Councillor for the same area and Project Lead for the Wallacetown Community Energy Project.
And good morning, my name is Holliday and I'm the CEO of Community Energy Scotland.
Thank you very much. We'll come to Ms Holliday first, I think. Can I ask you what your assessment is of the current state of Scotland's community energy sector?
So we have a very thriving community energy sector in Scotland. We have currently, as an organisation, we represent and advocate on behalf of more than 400 members, so 400 community organisations. And currently, based on our most recent State of the Sector survey, we've got around about just over 100 megawatts of capacity across Scotland. The majority of which is wind projects, and then also solar, hydro, and some other projects. And those projects are, creating a huge amount of turnover within communities, a huge amount of community benefits, both financial and non-financial, and are also engaging and building the capacity of the communities, not only as volunteers. We've got, last year we had reported nearly 1,400 volunteers working in community energy, but as well as that, 280 full-time employees were reported from 144 organisations that filled in our survey. And I think, when I know that kind of work has been quite a focus of this committee in previous sessions, and I think when you think that's 2.8 full-time employees per megawatt, and that won't even be all of them because not every organisation has filled in the survey. That's, I don't think you'd find anything comparable in the private sector. Mm-hmm.
Are there differences across the UK in terms of community energy? I mean, Scotland obviously has a rich bank of assets there, but does the situation differ much across the UK?
Yeah, I think that the community energy sector is actually surprisingly different when you look at Scotland versus the rest of the UK, and in a number of ways. Firstly, in terms of technology, if you look south of the border, you'll find that the predominant model is a solar model. Probably around, I would guess, I think it's around three quarters from the latest State of the Sector survey. Whereas, as I said, kind of certainly more than 2/3 of the megawatts in Scotland are down to wind projects. There's also kind of a different governance model is standard. So in Scotland, what tends to be is local development trusts, which are normally a charity, registered as a charity, and then set up companies as a subsidiary. That or the SCIO model, the Charitable Incorporated Organisation. Whereas south of the border, it tends to be more along the kind of co-op and community benefit model. Also in terms of financing, communities in Scotland tend to have gone down the line of financing through a kind of combination of bank finance and grants and loans, rather than the kind of community share offer. That's not across the board, but whereas again with the kind of co-op model down south, that tends to be more common. And then I think there's something also which, and again, this is very broad brush, but I do think that the motivation in Scotland in general is often coming out of the need of the communities. What you see is that in many cases, it's communities that are actually deprived, facing significant challenges, that are the ones who are taking these projects forward. We see a lot of island communities, rural communities, and these are set up because the communities themselves want to address fuel poverty, want to address resilience and energy resilience. Whereas I think often south of the border, and again, as I said, this is broad brush, it tends to be more of a kind of environmental incentive. That's not to say that that's not one of the motivations here, but I think that level of need is often the primary motivator.
Thank you. I'll pass to Kirsten Sullivan now.
Chair, I had a supplementary first of all. I was quite interested in your comment there about the different models in operation across the United Kingdom. Do you think there is scope and potential for more cooperative models in Scotland? And do you think those would benefit more communities?
I am actually like a strong advocate for the model that has been, to date in Scotland, because I think it does come out of development trusts that are really rooted in communities that really understand the priorities of the local areas and who are addressing a wide range of needs, not just kind of environmental ones. And then, like this often, and you'll hear from kind of my fellow panel members shortly about kind of the wider activities of their organisations, but, this is often a part of the organisation, but it's a means of finding a financial income stream rather than the primary activity of the organisation itself. So it's about enabling the activities and the priorities that the communities want to do. I think that, the co-op model is suitable in some areas, but I think that there's no reason. I think that kind of more opportunities for community share opportunities are like that. That is something that is an opportunity in Scotland, and that there have been examples. But I would very much caution that we would like to see a real distinction between what is community financing, which is a positive thing for people to have the opportunity to take, an investment themselves in local projects, and community energy. And if something is community financed, that does not make it a community energy project. In order for it to be a community energy project, it needs to be a project where the predominant purpose and the profits are flowing into the community to address their priorities. And I think sometimes there are examples where some of the co-op models start to blur lines with an investor club, where kind of essentially those who are able to pay and invest end up taking the profits themselves rather than it going to the community themselves.
I think further on in the discussion we'll come to the differences and perhaps benefits and pros and cons of community ownership versus community benefits. But do you think cooperatives would have a role to play in expanding community ownership?
I think that, every community has to look at what the government's model is most suitable for them. I do think that there are opportunities. But in general, most of the development trusts we're working with will still have opportunities for local people to become involved as members. They'll take a one member, one vote attitude, but it's just that you don't actually have to invest in order to be involved and to participate in those decisions. So as I said, I think that kind of every community will look at what the most suitable model is, but I would just caution that where a cooperative approach is being taken forward, it shouldn't be blurred with an investor club model. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Another supplementary from David.
Thanks, Chair. It's very helpful to hear your distinctions between the various models to stand up these projects. On the basis that we should never let perfection be the enemy of the good. I know from my own work in my own constituency, community energy seems like a distant pipe dream for a lot of people who are surrounded by massive industrial electrical infrastructure. So there must be a priority to, at pace, normalise community energy, that it isn't some distant, unachievable, pipe dream, that it can be achieved. And to that end, is that, what is happening in England that we could maybe do in Scotland to accelerate that? And similarly, what are we doing in Scotland, or what are you and your members doing in Scotland that would help accelerate it in England? Because in recognition of the growing disquiet from a lot of communities that are having to host massive, large-scale industrial electrical generation and transmission infrastructure, that actually there is room for them as well. What if you pick, one or two things from the way that it's evolving in England and use it in Scotland, and what you might think vice versa, England could benefit from what we're doing or you're doing in Scotland? What would those be?
Yeah, so I would say that kind of historically Scotland's probably a bit ahead of the game in terms of we probably had a slightly more established community energy sector before England. I think that the different models in terms of, for example, Alan represents a community that's taken forward a solar rooftop model, but that's still a relatively uncommon model in Scotland, where it's quite common down in England. So I think looking at what have been some of the kind of models that have become successful across the border and learning directly from those case studies. I think what we really see is that communities take inspiration from seeing another community that's done something similar and moving forward. So I think certainly looking at the different models that we have across the different countries within the United Kingdom and actually learning from those models is a really big opportunity. I think in Scotland, as well as the actual kind of inspirational projects that our members have, I think also we have been really privileged to have had the CARES funding programme running continuously now for, I believe, 14 years. So that while different kind of tranches of funding have come into that programme, and while it is always run on a year-to-year basis, which we'll probably come back to, I think that kind of knowing that there is that high-level support from the government has been a huge advantage to our sector. But I think one of the biggest kind of there is probably something that we need as a sector to do about shouting out about our successes, more about sharing these incredible projects. And what you do see is particularly that there's a ripple effect when you come to speak to Neil shortly. I mean, if you look at kind of the Outer Hebrides in particular, there have been so many excellent examples, and I think it's natural that you see one example and you think, well, we could do that because they're only down the road and they've done that. So I think that there's something there about us trying to just share more what the successes have been, what the impacts have been, and the opportunities for communities to get involved.
Another supplementary from Angus.
I attended a meeting in Strathpeffer, which was called the Convention of Community Councils, in the summer of last year. And there were, say, 200 people there. And the atmosphere was very, very against more, particularly wind, onshore wind in the Highlands. The community benefits were £7 million in the Highlands last year, and 30 across the whole of Scotland for a multi-billion-pound industry. And they have lost the support of the people in the Highlands because the community benefit is not large enough and the impact is too significant, I would say. Shared ownership, community ownership, which we're talking about now, would seem to be a very much better model. But in line with Dave Dugan's remarks, it does not seem to be happening in certainly in my constituency or my area of knowledge. And so we've had the Scottish Government consultation, we've had the UK Westminster Government consultation. I cannot see any major move happening which will transform that. And if you can see any, I think we'd love to know, because we're losing the audience as far as renewables are in the Highlands.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we look at the difference between a private and a community development, there's a completely different attitude towards wind turbines. The polling last year by YouGov showed that 62% of people in Scotland would support a community energy project in their area, compared to, I think it was 32% for a private development. And as you say, I mean, the community benefits that flow from commercial projects, even if they are following the current Scottish Government recommendations, which I know we've discussed before, that we both agree that should be raised significantly, given that they haven't increased since they were first introduced. But even if they're following that, then community energy will be providing multiple times the financial benefit, as well as all of these extra kind of social benefits, the investment in the community, the additional jobs. Multiple of our communities have become affordable housing providers, have regenerated and reopened community buildings, and businesses have supported communities with hardship and fuel poverty grants, all sorts of different benefits that we wouldn't see from those kind of smaller scale community benefits. In terms of how do we achieve that, I think that there is an opportunity with Great British Energy, and when you look at what their kind of overarching aims are, if we could kind of lever that and for it to happen in Scotland, it would be great. But unfortunately right now, and we have a really significant issue in terms of grid capacity, and following the results of the connection reforms last week, we wrote to Michael Shanks because the grid has essentially been allocated all the way up to 2035 in Scotland for all onshore solar, battery and wind. And without some kind of change, we've got a real challenge on our hands in terms of how many opportunities there are for communities to take forward projects. So we really need to see policies that actually prioritise community energy, recognising the additional social benefit and financial benefits that they have in local communities, because it's just incomparable. I mean, I think a report from Aquaterra a few years ago stated that community projects on average give 34 times more financial benefit to the local community than the recommended level, which not all communities are being paid. And if there a lot of them are even more extreme. If you look at the North Yell Development Trust, which is a tiny kind of community development trust on the island of Yell in the Shetlands, that's the community benefit that they are giving to their community is around the same amount per year as the ginormous Viking wind farm on the Shetland mainland, which is 100 times larger in capacity.
Thank you. I think we'll come on to some of those issues as we go through our agenda, but I'll pass to Kirsty Sullivan now.
So, a question for both Neil and Alan. What challenges did you face as community groups trying to establish a community energy project in Scotland? And following on from that, can you tell me about any specific policy interventions that you think would help remove the current barriers to establishing community energy projects? If I can go to Neil first.
Okay, thank you.
And nice to see you again, Neil.
And you as well. Okay, so there's no end of difficulties at the moment. There's the community groups at the moment which have got assets. We've got wind energy here in Lewis. Generally, these projects went through 10, 15 years ago when the regime was very different to what it is now. So there were schemes available, there was the subsidy support available in the past. All that's been removed now. So a lot of the support mechanisms which were available when we did ours back in 2015 or so, that's no longer there. So basically now you're subject to the market in effect, and communities find it difficult to compete with the other developers out there who have far more resources and far more technical knowledge. Communities generally are only dealing with one piece of land, so they have a site that they have identified and they don't have any other options, which makes things difficult. The resourcing is hard at the moment. The development funding is limited in some ways. We have got the CARES monies here, which are very helpful. But I think, as Zoe mentioned earlier on, they depend on the financial years, and you normally end up with a gap between the end of one funding amount and the start of the next one. The grid is always an issue, particularly in the more rural areas. The grid is limited. Now, in the islands here, we've got a major investment coming in the grid in about 5 years or so. It's a significant amount of new capacity, but unfortunately, because of the waiting list here over many years, then there's no capacity left at the moment, and so we're kind of left in the queue. The connections reform process, which was completed recently, again, as was mentioned, has effectively ruled out onshore wind for most of Scotland and particularly in the islands here. So there's a whole host of issues that we're wrestling with at the moment, and effectively without a difficult situation like this, then it's very hard to see the way forward. It effectively needs political will to change things, to give opportunities for the local organisations in the islands and other parts of the Highlands and Scotland and the UK to have an opportunity to come in the system. The grid situation is difficult. That's usually what you start off with, first of all. And that can take many, many years and is very expensive. Then the consenting side of things is difficult as well. Again, that's very expensive and can take 2 years potentially. So there's a whole range of things at the moment which are facing us, and there's usually numerous setbacks along the way. So basically, community projects would need to be given designations in the system so that the grid operators are looking at them in a favourable way, capacity being made available on the grid as well. The support mechanism financially is difficult. There isn't really anything at the moment for the communities. They would have to compete in the auctions, which again would be difficult. So we're looking at a whole range of potential interventions, I think, in the process from government level, and we can talk about these later on potentially.
Thanks, Neil. If I can ask Alan.
Thank you. So there was a number of challenges we faced and we were able to overcome, but there's some ongoing challenges. So to start, our project was fully funded, so we were lucky. We got funding from Scottish Government and we got funding from SSEN Transmission Net Zero Fund, so it was a full funding package. But the first hurdles we had to overcome was legal agreement. So this is a challenge for communities. We tend to enter into obviously a legal agreement because we were talking to the council about getting access to the roof space on the 3 buildings. So it wasn't a lease of the building, it was access to the roofs for 25 years. So we went into negotiation with a number of legal companies and the price range was huge. We ranged from over £10,000 down to under £5,000 eventually. But we had to create the model, and it was an interesting model. We set up a joint working group between the association and the council legal team, and we worked behind the scenes to create a draft agreement. Once we got to a sort of comfortable position, we then engaged with our legal advisors, and they looked at it through a traffic light system, red, amber, green, where they were able to identify things were okay, things we might need to take cognizance of, and the red areas were areas which would be a challenge. And then we were able to go back into the full negotiation with the council, and we eventually got to a full agreement. One of the things that maybe bring it to the committee's attention was if all the community projects are engaging in legal discussion, there could be an advantage here in terms of a national agreement or a national framework, maybe agreed through COSLA, that impacts on all 32 councils, and that might loosen up things in terms of how communities can move forward with the legal, because it is a minefield, and because a lot of these community associations are just people giving of their time and might not have legal expertise. We had a solicitor on the committee, but he didn't have the expertise that was needed for this particular exercise. So that's one thing. The other thing was insurance impact. So again, one of the things that came to light fairly early on was we asked the council to engage with the insurers to see if this project is going ahead, would there be any impact? And we ended up having to meet with the loss adjusters because they brought to our attention, well, we're not happy, for example, you're putting solar panels on a flat roof using a ballast system. Is the roof combustible? So if it was the case, we wouldn't like that. We might impact on insurance. Are you putting inverters in roof spaces and loft spaces? So again, not to get into detail, we worked through that with them and we got solutions. But it's to be mindful of that the insurance companies are risk averse and are already looking at strengthening the whole approach to installations on public buildings. So to be mindful of that. The other thing is, I mentioned insurance. There's a crucial thing at the moment. So although we are fully installed, we're generating, one of the things we're deeply involved at the moment is export tariff, which is a minefield. So the council at the moment is supplied through a procurement scheme through Scotland, which is through EDF. So I thought it would be prudent to approach EDF. So eventually we got to EDF having to ask my MP to intervene. That's a different story. So we got to head of complaints, we got to through a business advisor at EDF. And there was a long, protracted discussion about what rates were available. And the best rate that could be offered was 5.6 pence per kilowatt hour. The comment from them, and I can send copies to the committee, was we're currently looking at a smart export guarantee business rate, but there's no timeline to this. And I managed to speak to Ofgem as well, and he said, well, energy companies are obliged to offer a community rate, and I did phone other companies, and it ranged from 3 pence a unit to 4 pence a unit. So it's a huge problem, this. I've got to make the committee aware. I got a letter from the Minister of Energy, Michael Shanks, and he's asked that I meet with his team to discuss that this is a huge problem, because the energy companies see it as a risk in terms of community energy projects generating into the grid, especially solar. They're risk averse to this because they work their costs against wholesale prices. So it's just, again, bringing this to your attention. That's something that's ongoing. Remembering our system was designed to be over capacity, in that it roughly will generate 50% of it generates for the use of the buildings, and is probably available another 50% for export purposes. So currently we don't have a contract, so we're losing out in this. The best we can get, we've got a company called Unity are offering us 7.8 pence a unit, but that's a best, talking to other community groups across Scotland, that's roughly the best rate at the moment. If you or I put solar panels on the roofs tomorrow, we would be offered 15 pence. So just to give you the balance of that. The other two final challenges, and one seems a simple thing, but it's not. So 2 of the schools require to have their meters changed over to smart meters, because unless they're smart meters, we can't measure what's been exported. So the council has a contract with IMServe as a company based in Milton Keynes, and they were contacted in relation to get the meters changed over. The date we've been given is March of this year. They have 1 technician covering Scotland, and we can't move forward in this export until we get these meters changed. So I thought it's appropriate to bring it to the attention of the committee. So we're still ongoing with that. The final challenge we faced, we've now resolved it, was setting up bank accounts. So we had to set up 2 bank accounts, which was the charity bank account and the trustee account, which took a while. We ended up getting 2 rounds of compensation from the bank. And then the final account was to do with setting up the business account. Very briefly, the reason we've had to do that, we've had to set up a trading company within the association. So we will invoice through that, and the money coming back will go back to the association, the charity, and we'll gift aid into the community benefit fund. So there's no money lost in that. But it took from October till last week to get this account set up. And again, another 2 rounds of compensation, and also no point of contact in the branch. Everything had to be done on the phone, even the application had to be done on the phone, which was 2 hours, and everything then by telephone, and no business advisor in the branch at all. So that's probably a quick summary of some of the issues we've had to face on the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan and Neil. I think you've given an incredible level of detail there, and you've given quite a bit of insight into some of the challenges and potentially the interventions that could assist. I'm particularly interested in what you mentioned, Alan, because some of your challenges required a high level of professional insights, and you had to seek external advice, which is costly, lengthy process. I just wonder if there are mechanisms to be sharing the advice and expertise that you got perhaps with climate action networks. I know one in my own constituency, the West Lothian Climate Action Network, are looking to do work with solar, and a lot of groups across the country are probably going to come across the same issues. I'm mindful of time, so if you could just perhaps address that point, and then if you could both just advise what you see as the key benefits that your projects have delivered to the community.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a great believer in not working in silos. So I've always said from day one in this project, we want to share it across as many people as possible. There's this idea of keep reinventing the wheel, it's crazy. So we have tapped into lots of expertise and support. When I started, I had some knowledge, because my background's education, both FE and HE, and I was able to tap into the university, because I worked at University of Strathclyde, but I also reached out to other, so the community energy group in Glasgow, Callum Watkins and Jim Lee for Energy for All. I reached out to these people, and we started a relationship in terms of networking. to tap into their expertise. And similarly, I was able to share them. And that's an important thing in this whole community, the community engagement. It's a bigger community through Zoe's team at Community Energy Scotland, and really getting to the finer detail of the issues that really impact on making things happen. One thing I should mention, one of the things have a challenge with in terms of the funding, so this is going into community benefit, and I'll come to the specifics in that. It was to do with, we're having to build a reserve fund in terms of decommission costs. And the decommission costs at the moment would cost us £10,000 to £12,000 per school. Now, the councils are risk averse, and I get that, but we're having to take money from the community benefit fund to build that reserve. And my plea would be to the committee, could you consider ways we can mitigate against this for communities? Because it's a huge cost. There's still residue value in this commodity, because solar panels, we know, after 25 years, they're still generating. So that's certainly in our agreement. We couldn't get rid of that red line on the contract. We basically have to take the support of that. Community benefit. So this project was driven from bottom up, very much focused on the schools to start with. And we ran a competition in school logo to get the Gen Alphas excited. We're starting to see benefits, because already we've had Education Scotland coming in with meetings with the head teachers. To be aware, in Scotland, the curriculum sustainability education is now mandatory, will embed into the curriculum by 2030, from early years right through to S6. So already they're seeing this project as a vehicle to see practitioners in action, and a reference site where other practitioners can see sustainability. I mean, in the schools, there's monitors showing the generation, showing the data, and the kids can use this for their STEM development, even at early years. The early years are already doing things like this, because these kids are digitally active, and this is giving them an encouragement. The other thing, where there's been a huge involvement, is through Primary Engineer UK. So again, Chief Exec Susan Scarlett has met with the head teachers, and already there's funding being made available for the project to develop the programmes and to help the practitioners within the schools. So we're beginning to see that. The Community Benefit Fund will be bottom-up driven. So we have an established advisory panel which will look at projects driven by the community. As I said to them openly, this is your bank of money, this is for you to use. I've got responsibility, or the charity's got responsibility to carry out impact studies. But again, through our partnership with University of Strathclyde and Ayrshire College, we'll be able to do the impact studies through Fraser Ballender Institute, because they did our initial feasibility study as part of the relationship. So it's about networking and bringing things together.
Thank you. And Neil, if I could just ask you briefly to talk about the benefits to your community.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we've been receiving income now from wind energy for about 10 years or so, and it has made a big impact within our area. First of all, within our own organisation, the Trust has now got a team of 15 people. So when the Trust started off initially, there was just one. So we've built up a team here, and that's people employed in the office here in the area, in the Trust, permanent contracts as well. So there's the 15 people employed here, plus there's impacts in other organisations as well. We give out monies to local organisations to help them with their activities. So there's about probably 15 or so organisations in the area, which are all locally run volunteers in the main, who come to us for assistance, usually every year, for various different investments and projects. There's a number of these which are vital to retain population. A number of these now are dependent upon us as a partner. We partner with the council, with other development agencies and other local initiatives. We're looking at investments in housing in the area, so we're taking the lead role in that just now. We're looking at tourism investments as well, and we've got some initiatives running with local organisations to host visitors in the area, particularly ones who come in on the cruise boats. And that's a new initiative which has been kicked off in the last 2 years or so. So we have a big push in the area to retain population. We have got ageing population here, and we're losing people to other parts of the island and to the mainland as well. We're supporting activities in the schools. We're helping with the health issues, with the fuel issues as well in the area. We had a scheme a number of years ago to assist with costs in heating homes, and we're looking at schemes with other organisations at the moment to do improvements in people's homes so that they can reduce the heat loss and to install renewables as well in the future. That's just a snapshot of what's involved here, and I think it's been mentioned already, it's now become normalised, so a lot of the residents and organisations now depend upon us, and if that was no longer available, then that would leave a large hole in the area.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you very much. I think we saw a number of the initiatives you have at Galson when we visited last year, and it was very impressive. I'm very conscious of time. I'm going to move on now to Dave Dugan.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much, Alan. Particularly, you give us a real insight into the challenges and pitfalls and the need for real resolve to take this from conception through to delivery, and everywhere you turn there's another challenge. Not the least of those is funding. And maybe from Zoe as well, or Neil indeed, is to try and help the committee understand the sort of, is there a generic or nearly generic funding model that communities can go for, or is it all very diffused and it's all very dependent on each community project's individual circumstances? Because it seems that, you know, the more routine and standardised that this approach could be, that's one less thing for individual community organisations to think about. Whether they meet the criteria or not is a different matter. But if there's an expeditious and sort of vaguely standardised approach to generating the funding, that seems to me that it would be helpful. Does that exist? And what does it look like?
Yeah, I think it is genuinely a challenge. I wouldn't say it's completely standardised, but I would say probably the most sort of standard model is a combination of accessing whatever grants are available, so including CARES, but also, you know, depending on the area you're in, there are quite often local grants and grant schemes, particularly those related to kind of community benefit funds from kind of existing turbines. So some.
You just expand a little bit on CARES, Zoe. What is the funding pot? I know it's annual. Where does it come from?
So the CARES programme, I'm not going to tell you what the funding pot is offhand because I will get it wrong. But it's, if I had to guess, I think it would be 14 million this year. I think like over the course, I think I wrote down how much they've given out in total somewhere, which I'll find as I speak to you. So the funding available, currently they've got a few streams. One is for community buildings, so to kind of improve community buildings, put in heat pumps and solar panels, etc. They've got a generation growth programme, so that's for the larger generation projects. And then there's a kind of variety of support available from kind of the team, including on shared ownership. There's a new Launchpad programme which we're delivering in partnership with the consortium, which is led by, it's the Local Energy Scotland consortium led by the Energy Saving Trust. There's also, now a kind of small development fund, which was only introduced halfway through this year, which is to support resource, so whether that's for the communities to hire someone themselves or to bring in external resource. That's something that I'd like to see continue into the following years, because obviously the challenge is when the funding's only come halfway through the financial year to kind of employ someone in that time has been a bit of a challenge for a lot of communities. So I think they've, what my note was that they distributed 74 million to date to 1,600 organisations.
Where does that funding come from? So
the majority has come from Scottish Government funds. This year, the money that Great British Energy gave to sort of Scotland as its allocation was also put into the Generation Growth Fund. So this year is 4-point-something million. That was what was kind of distributed to Scotland, and I believe there was maybe a little bit extra distributed recently with the new announcement. I'm not sure what scale that was. So rather than take that approach of putting projects directly on schools and hospitals, that has gone directly to communities in Scotland.
I think to come in terms of your question, it's a good question. the reason our project took 4 years in that there was no funding available. So at the time, CARES were not funding solar panel installation. The spend money Scottish came in later, and it was only when that triggered then CARES programme changed to fund rooftop solar installation. So having a fund, it was continually available to fund these definitive types of projects would be good. So that pot of money would be there. So that would create an encouragement of communities who probably have common objectives of what they're trying to achieve for their communities in the areas, whereas it was the areas of deprivation, and that's what we're trying to challenge. So that was clear. So when our bid, it was fine, that was recognised, but the challenge for us was getting to the funding pot. It took that length of time.
So sorry, I was interrupted, so it kind of sounds like I stopped on grants. Normally it's a combination of grants and then bank finance. Yeah. So normally it's kind of a bank loan. That's the most standard model in Scotland. So like normally the grants would be a relatively small proportion, but obviously they can kind of bring down that overarching cost.
Would I be right in saying the grants will need to be in place first before the banks will be interested?
No, I mean all of the schemes essentially just have to build a business model that makes sense. The biggest challenge in general for communities is that early stage finance where the project is at a higher level of risk. Potentially you're having to do kind of feasibility and sort of things where actually the money isn't necessarily going to come back if the feasibility shows that actually the project isn't viable. So those early stage funding is often the most difficult for communities. But in general, communities have to essentially make a model that stacks up as a business model, and just in the same way that a private enterprise would. And actually what we're seeing is often bigger projects actually stack up better these days than kind of the smaller projects. So I'm sure Neil had previously told you when you visited about their kind of ambitious 40 megawatt plus project, and that's the sort of kind of ambition that we're hoping we'll start to see more of if we can get access to the grid. But I think there is a role here in terms of de-risking some of the finance, and that's something that kind of GB Energy could be coming in to do, to kind of de-risk finance for projects taken forward. And the other issue that we have is in terms of not having that guaranteed income. The larger projects would be able to access the Contracts for Difference programme. It's an incredibly complex process, and obviously only available of a certain project size. So what we would really like to see come through is a minimum income, a floor price for so not to be subsidised like a feed-in tariff, but just to have a minimum floor price kind of which gives then communities the ability to build a business model based on that, and the banks the confidence that is a kind of minimum level of income that will come in the future. Likewise, as Alan referred to, for those that are private wire, to have an enhanced smart export guarantee programme.
Okay, Chair, thanks.
Thank you. I am terribly conscious of time, and I hate to have to do this, but I have to ask members and panellists to be as succinct as they possibly can from here on in, otherwise we're not going to get through everything we need to get through today. Can I ask then, Great British Energy has indicated that it wants to develop a model that enables what they've called simplification and modularity for community energy projects. Do you think that's an approach that would be sensible or necessary, and what could that look like in practice?
I would be cautious about that without seeing the details. I think there's definitely a role for sort of some standardised documents, etc. Kind of standardised contracts. I know that's something they're already looking into with shared ownership, and again some standardised kind of financial models that they're offering. I guess my concern about that is firstly that what we don't want to see is a kind of English approach being forced on Scotland when they are quite different contexts, as I've spoken about already. But also, like the realities of the communities we're working with, they are so diverse that actually how much can they be standardised? I think that's kind of one question. But also the other thing that I would really emphasise is that you can't be kind of sort of building a project and handing it over to a community group. Like there needs to be the process of the community themselves being involved in that process and building their capacity throughout that process rather than just kind of handing that across. And I would just flag one specific issue as well, is the issue I know that was mentioned, I think, in the strategy about kind of having a sort of listed sort of trusted delivery partners and technologies. And I think That is something we've really struggled with in Scotland in terms of the microgeneration certification scheme, etc., because the reality is that, when you're looking in rural Scotland, it's hard enough to get any installer. And actually, if those installers who are already busy and have no real need to go and get this accreditation because they've got work on the books already, if you're not able to use those because they don't have the accreditation, you essentially then fall out of potential support. So I would be very hesitant about that being an obligation. It's great if it's an opportunity for people to access to avoid having to go through their own procurement processes, but it can't be an obligation, or we're going to find that actually whole communities just literally can't access it because they just can't, they don't have the local suppliers available. And there's already, if you're trying to find someone on an island, the additional cost of bringing people to do that is huge.
But if Great British Energy could come up with a model that said, for example, to Mr Roseweir's project, well, it's been done somewhere else in a very similar fashion. Here's how they did it. Here are the contracts they used. Here's the legal advice they got. Please use that, and don't follow it to the nth degree, but take it forward. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think definitely having standardised templates available, having kind of support available, utilising the existing network of organisations and kind of making sure, and also building up the capacity of all the relevant organisations like local authorities, like not just supporting community groups, but also kind of supporting planners, supporting those who can actually have a facilitating role.
Do you think that the UK is on track to meet the 8 gigawatts of community energy by 2030 that Great British Energy has got as a target?
I'm highly doubtful. I think that there should be a kind of some indication by looking at what is already in this recent grid reform process. You should be able to get quite a good indication of how many of those are community projects. So I would imagine some calculations could be done. The reality is that kind of in order to meet that 2030 target, most of that should kind of already be in the system. And so the real opportunity to meet that 2030 target is probably going to come through shared ownership. And right now we need to see, a real focus on that, both in terms of potentially taking forward the mandatory approach that was consulted on last year, but also actually incentivize, because all the mandatory approach would do is ask developers to offer shared ownership. It doesn't actually mandate them to actually secure a deal. So there needs to be some kind of incentives for developers, whether that's whether that's improved access to the grid, whether that's an enhanced CFD if they've got X% shared ownership offer. But that is I think a significant concern. And my concern now is, will that 8 gigawatts be predominantly made up of projects elsewhere in the UK because of the situation we're facing in Scotland?
Okay. Ask Christine Sullivan now.
Yes, thank you. Just very briefly, how do you think the GB Energy's forthcoming local power plan can actually add value to the existing community energy support schemes that are available? And do you think there's maybe a risk of confusion or duplication because of the very distinct schemes that the Scottish Government has in Scotland?
I think that kind of alignment and coordination is going to be key. I have been heartened by the fact that to date they have been trying to kind of work with the Scottish Government and align with CARES and so on. So I'm hoping that approach will continue going forward. In terms of kind of what we'd like to see coming through that, I've already spoken about kind of the minimum price guarantee and the enhanced smart export guarantee. One thing I would really like to see, we've kind of, I think, all mentioned now the kind of challenge around existing funding, government funding being tied to financial years. I think the fact that GB sits out with the government system gives a real opportunity for funding that can cross financial years, whether it's multi-year funding or whether it just literally allows you to extend into the next year. Because the challenge is, by the time you apply for funding, get the offer, you've already hit the winter months, which makes the actual process much more challenging, but also you've just got that tight time scale. So actually, if you're wanting to take forward ambitious projects, having that multi-year funding would be a real opportunity. Other things that we would like to see are the commitment to the target itself, but also delineating between the target between community energy, municipal energy, and anything else that's been counted towards this local and community energy target, because one thing we've learned from Scotland is that currently only 10% of what is being counted towards progress towards the Scottish local and community energy target is actually community energy. The vast majority of it is farms and estates, local enterprises and so on, which we would not consider to be community energy, and it doesn't have the same impact. So what we don't want to see is that target being diluted. So we would really like to see specific delineation of what that actual target looks like, which organisations are eligible. We'd also like to see the £1 billion annual commitment that was in the manifesto being upheld for funding for local authorities and communities. We'd like to see capacity building not only in the form of expert support, and I would like to see that expert support bolstering existing trusted intermediaries, not just being built within GB Energy, but also to actually provide resource funding for communities themselves to be able to take forward the projects and to build up their own capacity during that process. And then, kind of flexible funding of the mix of grants, loans and equity, and as I said earlier, kind of de-risking of projects, especially in the early stages. And really encouraging local authority partnerships with community organisations, so encouraging where there are local projects being taken forward by municipalities to actually encourage them to involve communities as partners, or even shared equity, projects, shared ownership. And again, that facilitation of shared ownership, so whether that's being made mandatory, whether that's rewarding the kind of developers, but having a really stronger policy position on that shared ownership.
Next question to Kirsten.
Sorry, you are indeed correct, Chair. What factors influence community energy projects' connection to the grid, and what do you think would improve this process? Because you've spoken quite a lot about the issues, but what do you think would help? And that's a question for everyone, but again, as the Chair said, I'm really mindful of time, so if we could
very
just
short
be
time, we're actually overrunning
please.
now, so we need to really crack on.
I mean, we have kind of written recently, we put out a kind of recent report. One of the most things, and I guess probably maybe the number one thing I would ask the committee to take away today is the need for designation for community energy to be considered to be needed within the process and therefore be given priority within the grid. So that would be the number one issue. The other is in terms of the current difference between the transmission impact assessment between Scotland and England. Essentially, within England, those projects that are under 5 megawatts don't have to fall under this new process, so they can go ahead without going through the reformed process and the gates. Whereas in Scotland, that threshold is currently set at 200 kilowatts on the mainland and 50 kilowatts on the island. So essentially, we're talking kind of tens of scales different of how big projects communities can take forward without having to go through this process and without having those kind of capacity limits applied. And then the other thing we would like to see is to ensure that kind of all of the current processes that are being developed, so the SSEP, the RESP and so on, are all being coordinated and aligned with the reformed process, and particularly that the RESP is being taken into account, because that is a bottom-up process that's going to have local priorities identified, and in many cases I think community energy will form part of that.
We'll move it along.
I think that's covered the other questions.
Okay, Eve Dugan.
Just very briefly, would it be helpful if, given that challenge that you so clearly highlighted, Alan, that these are my words, not yours, at 3 pence per kilowatt hour, your energy is basically just being taken, it's scarcely being sold. So given that challenge, and I know that community energy, one of the big hurdles is getting access to the market because of the regime that Ofgem put in place, which is faintly ridiculous for community energy. So wouldn't it be helpful if GB Energy was to provide community energy schemes across GB with a front door to the market, if they were somehow the connector, not literally the connector, but they were that you didn't have to find a customer for your excess energy if you're not private wire, that GB Energy could facilitate that, and they could just aggregate all community energy through the front door of GB Energy into the UK supply, and facilitate that with all the various energy companies and network owners, and network operators. Wouldn't that be a real gift?
It's an interesting thought, and I think that would give communities confidence in terms of both their system design and the impact of what community benefits going to realise in the fund going forward. Remember, these projects are 25 years, so it's a lot of money can be generated over that period. So anything that mitigates against these low tariffs would be very welcome. Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an interesting idea. Obviously, like, I think, as I've said, that if there was that kind of guarantee of kind of a price per unit exported, I think that's going to make a significant difference. So I think it's definitely an interesting model that should be investigated.
Any indication that GB Energy are looking at that?
Not as far as I am aware in terms of that kind of idea. I do know that they have looked into like the opportunities for kind of minimum pricing versus kind of a community CFD type concept, so something like that. But I don't know where they've got to with that.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Angus MacDonald.
I think you can skip mine if you want.
Fine, thank you. So I'll ask you the next question then. Community Energy Scotland has suggested that the re-empowering of repowering of commercial wind farms could create opportunities for community buyouts. What action, if any, would be required from the government to facilitate that to happen? And, well, I'll ask you that first of all. What would be needed to make that happen?
Yeah, so I think repowering does provide a really big opportunity for communities. There is a current pilot has just been launched a couple of months ago by the Scottish Government and Forestry and Land Scotland. They've identified 10 sites where they're going to essentially allow communities to have the opportunity to put forward interest kind of a year before they come up to be actually leased to private organisations. We would rather have seen that across all of the sites, but obviously every pilot is welcome. I think that the opportunity on public land is is something that the government has direct power over. We'd also like to potentially see opportunities in kind of negotiation with the Crown Estate. But yeah, I think that kind of potentially using any powers like, obviously this is devolved, but kind of planning powers to kind of encourage community ownership to be prioritised through that planning process. So I think kind of really anything that can be done to kind of encourage that to be seen as being more positive. But also, I mean, really it's about actually giving communities access to information, so kind of knowledge of like when are different sites coming up so having potentially a national database available, and then having that kind of expert support for communities to tap into to actually be able to kind of understand how to enter those negotiations, how to develop that project. But yeah, I mean, especially given the situation with the grid, that's essentially grid capacity that's already being used. So yeah, I think it is one of the biggest opportunities right now.
And my last question is going to be to Neil specifically, because I think you're more toward this end of your project. What challenges associated with decommissioning might a community energy group face, Neil?
Yeah, well, I think obviously the ideal would be to make sure that the assets are kind of used, for as long as possible. Yeah. So the repowering ideas are being considered at the moment. Zoe's already mentioned that to a certain extent. So the communities in the island here are considering about how they can extend life, perhaps, of turbines at the moment to maybe replace them potentially. But the way the market has moved is that turbines are now much larger. So the smaller ones that the communities have here are not readily available on the market anymore. And so it's not that easy to consider the end of life issues. I suppose taking them away is not the ideal. and if we can find a way around that, but there are many hurdles, so there's no subsidy available. Turbines would therefore need to be larger to be viable. At the moment, I think the communities are dealing with turbines which are smaller than are available on the market at the moment. There are the planning issues. Effectively, even if you are looking at replacing them, you'd be starting all over again from planning regime. So there are many hurdles there. I think we need companies' technical advice and help, and the suppliers available in the market who can offer turbines at the scale needed.
That's great, thank you very
much.
I
think just if I can add very quickly, I think there's also a sort of a need for a presumption that those projects will get grid access kind of at the end of their lifetime, and also potentially within the planning system, a sort of presumption in favour of a project that is continuing at a sort of a scale within a similar bounds. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much indeed for being with us today. We're now going to move on to our second panel, but we'll go into private session as we do. So thank you all again very much. It's been really interesting and helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, Neil. To gallop along a bit here. Meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee, and I'd like to welcome our second panel and thank them in advance for coming to give evidence to us today. Could I just ask you all briefly to introduce yourselves and say what your role is? I'll start with Gail.
Good morning, thank you. So I'm Gail Anderton, I'm Community Benefits Manager for Highland Council.
Good morning, I'm Christianna Logan. I'm the Director of Customers and Stakeholders for SSEN Transmission, part of the SSE Group.
Morning all, Finley Becks-Phelps, I'm the Head of Development for Nadara.
Hello, I'm Lynda Mitchell, CEO at ALIEnergy, Charitable Energy Agency.
Thank you for that. In March, the UK Government published guidance on community funds for those hosting new network infrastructure, and in May outlined proposals for a mandatory benefits scheme, as we've been discussing, for those hosting generation developments. Would you like to give a quick assessment of that approach, what you think that approach will achieve? I'll start with Gail.
So thank you. We welcome within Highland Council the mandation of a community benefit. I think from experience that we've had with communities across Highland, the current system, being a voluntary system, can be inconsistent, lacks transparency. Some communities are getting really good deals. We'd like to see an opportunity for funding to be spread across the whole of the Highlands and not just for those locally impacted communities, although we recognise that those communities ideally need to have something. But yes, we would fully support mandation.
Christianna, any thoughts from you?
Yes, we very much welcomed the inclusion of community benefit for electricity transmission infrastructure within that. The guidance on that has given our regulator confidence to approve that investment within our business plans. We expect that to be well over £100 million associated with our projects in the north of Scotland. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank Angus for helping us build cross-party support for inclusion of upgrades, significant upgrades to network infrastructure within that. I think it's very important that communities hosting that upscaled infrastructure also receive these benefits. SSE has a long history of community benefit, and we're very excited by the opportunity that's now there for us to take that into the communities hosting this transmission infrastructure. We launched a community benefit fund for our region ahead of that guidance because of our view that it is critical that these local communities do get that benefit from hosting that infrastructure.
Thank you. Finley?
I think if we were to mandate, I think in principle that's wise, and it's good that developers then are adhering to that. The element I would add into that is also ensuring that there's a flexibility as part of that. Every community around Scotland is very unique, and they operate in very different ways as well. And the opportunities for community benefit are really quite vast, but will look very different per community. So I think whatever comes off the back end of this, if the flexibility is there to allow new initiatives to come forward in those different areas, then that's something we would welcome.
Thank you. Lynda?
Yeah, I think anything that can improve and increase the amount of community benefits that's coming through to particularly the deprived communities in Scotland, I think it's a good thing. As far as consistency is concerned, it would be good to have a more a kind of consistent approach in that more developers give money to communities through the community benefit funds, but also there is an issue, I think, about how widely geographically the community benefit funds are spread, in that some projects focus on a very small geographic area, which can result in quite large amounts of money coming to quite small communities, and then other ones it's much more geographically spread so that there's benefit to more people, and perhaps there needs to be flexibility, obviously, because all communities are different, but there's sometimes a bit of a kind of unfairness, I think, in the distribution of community benefit funds, which it would be interesting to explore.
Can I ask you then, Dr. Mitchell, and I'll then ask the rest of the panel too, how would you define community then? I think that would be one of the challenges I would see in that whole discussion, so it'd be interesting to know how that community would be defined.
That's a really good question, and I think a lot of developers come in and they will define the local community as perhaps the areas where community council areas that are maybe within sight of a development, for example. But I would quite like to see it widened a bit more. At least I feel that some of the community benefit funds maybe need to be spread more widely, because we have communities in Scotland who have sight of many wind farms. We also have communities that have sight of no wind farms, and you can come to the result where people in one glen have lots of money coming from community benefit funds, people in the next glen have severe fuel poverty, for example, which we work on at ALIEnergy a lot, who have no access to these funds, and perhaps it would be good to, I totally support the idea that some of the community funds should go to a more regional pot.
Okay, do you have any thoughts on that one, Finley?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the journey that, particularly for onshore wind, was where I'm focused on primarily, has evolved so much over the past 2 decades that I think Dr. Mitchell mentions about the site of turbines. The original community benefit was introduced more to allow communities to benefit from having a renewable energy project in their area, irrespective of whether they've seen it or not. And that's evolved significantly over the years. And having now done this for quite a long time, historically, when you brought forward a new development, you would almost sort of draw a sort of 10-kilometre radius around that, and that was deemed to be your immediate community, and that's where you focus your community benefit. I think, put my hands up, I think that world has come and gone a little bit. We have 45 community benefit projects throughout the UK, and every one of them looks entirely different. We have ones where we give community benefit directly to the immediate community, but also then go to the local authority to allow them to distribute to a wider area as well. So I think in terms of the definition of the community can be reassessed. We are now dealing with much bigger turbines, so the community benefit, particularly when we begin to repower projects, is going to significantly increase. And then when we are dealing now with potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds, I think that more rural communities, that becomes a very overwhelming sense of money. and actually how best to administer that, how best to distribute that. I think that's a wise conversation to have.
Okay. Christianna, do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I would say what's important is the flexibility that guidance-based approaches give us. A local community in an urban area or a rural area can look very different, and the needs of those communities can be very different. So having flexibility to tailor funds to those requirements is most important, I would say, within the design of any future rules and guidance. For us, we agree that there is a need for broader areas to feel the benefit from this transition and these investments, and that's why we've set up our funds so that some of the funding goes into a regional pot that's available to communities all across of our network area. And that means that those who don't have infrastructure right on their doorstep are still able to deliver really impactful projects. In SSE's history with its regional development funds, the Sustainable Development Fund, they've been able to deliver a social return on investment of £11 for every pound of funding invested. So the opportunity for an amplifier effect in these local areas is huge.
Gail?
Yeah, I think I would agree with quite a lot of what has already been said, particularly Lynda, in relation to that. In rural locations specifically, there are quite affluent communities that are benefiting from a significant amount of share from things, whereas we've got other communities that aren't. But looking at our geographical location, a lot of communities are impacted in some way or shape or form through that development process. And the communities also, particularly in a Highland context, have to move to more urbanised areas to be able to shop, socialise, use facilities. So to allow us that flexibility to do a local community fund plus that wider local authority regional fund would allow us to support some of the activity that's needed within those areas as well to accommodate everybody's needs.
Understand the complications. A supplementary from Angus MacDonald, and then you have your own question thereafter.
Christianna, thank you for your shout out. I'll give you the £5 afterwards. There are two things which really worry me. First of which is the root of the problems in remote Scotland is lack of housing, because you can't keep people in the area. And you have kindly volunteered a number of legacy housing. Now, I had a meeting a year and a half ago with SSEN, and we discussed the whole thing about housing. The person who was responsible then has left, and I have been unable to get clear answers to this. Now, I have two bits of information from you. One is 500 legacy housing in the north of Scotland, and one is 1,000. And both those bits of information have come from SSEN recent. Can you explain what you can do about legacy housing?
Absolutely.
And the second, and because I can't tell you how important that is, because that would make a workers' camp in Broadford of 400 people in a village which has only got 800 is very intrusive from the people on the island of Skye. And the second thing is they're offering 17,500 jobs for the north of Scotland, but all we see is workers' camps of people coming up from the south. They're not local jobs. So I'd love a bit of clarification on this.
A bit more colour to that. So just to explain for the benefit of the committee, our commitment for housing associated with our projects is to build 1,000 permanent homes in the north of Scotland that will be initially used as accommodation for workers on the projects, but will then be provided within communities for use there, either for sale or as affordable rent. And 60% of the 1,000 homes will be affordable homes. It's 500 homes in the Highland region, and that's part of our commitment within the Social Value Charter. So the rest of the homes are across the wider network area, up in Caithness, across in the north east. We recently announced a commitment in the Western Isles and also in Brechin. They were our first housing developments that we have signed contracts on. And those developments have been worked up in collaboration with the local authorities based on the areas that they've identified as needing housing for development, and are being taken forward in partnership with social landlords, housing associations and councils. And as far as possible, we're using local contractors for the development of those projects, for example, on the Western Isles as well. In terms of the commitment in jobs, we have made the commitment for 17,500 jobs in North Scotland, but that is across all of our supply chain and activity on these projects. We will have jobs specifically in our organisation. Our offices in Inverness and in Aberdeen have grown materially over recent years. We had to open a new office in Aberdeen and expand our office in Inverness. And we have our supply chain opening offices in the likes of Thurso and Alness. And those are roles in those communities during construction, but also during the operations of the infrastructure once it's built. There will be an impact in local areas during construction, and there will need to be some temporary camps to accommodate the volume of the workforce. But by committing to permanent homes and permanent jobs, we are bringing enduring legacy benefits into these communities as well. We recently committed to 600 new Earn as You Learn roles within SSE transmission specifically, which is apprenticeships, graduate apprenticeships and trainee schemes associated with these specific projects as well.
Move on to your own question now.
Can I just get a very quick? I know we're pushed.
Very, very quick, Dave.
How are these houses going to be transacted once SSEN have finished with them in terms of your own requirements and they go over to a social landlord? Are they gifted? Are they sold? How does that work?
There are different commercial models for the different projects, and those are still being negotiated with all of the parties that we're working with. But in some cases, we are making a significant capital contribution in the region of 60-70% of the cost of the development of the homes, and it means that then the enduring owner can take ownership of those homes at a reduced rate. And that brings it into what is affordable, for example, for local authorities to develop as affordable housing, or the same for registered social landlords.
Angus.
Gail, this is a question for you. NPF 4 was meant to bring a requirement for an economic advantage for communities when renewable energy or when energy infrastructure was put in. And to my opinion, when I was on the planning committee of the Highland Council, that did not happen. Do you see any changes in planning which will result in a requirement for renewable energy projects to benefit the community?
I think that we are starting to see coming through following NPF4 introduction that there is the more social economic output. We're starting to see more commitments in those planning applications coming forward in relation to jobs, social economic, investment in local supply chains, etc. So we are starting to see a change of that direction towards community wealth building and how that's going to look. I think it's still very much early days in relation to how that's coming through. And I know some of the Scottish renewables, for example, have been working with developers to look at a
landing after dark.
A template which will give consideration for developers to work through in relation to putting forward that. So I think we're starting to see a little bit of change in that direction, but I think it's going to be very much a work in progress to see how that develops going forward.
In my experience, the wind farm developer would come forward. This is a real example. One said to me, "We're offering 45 jobs in the north of Skye." And I said, "I don't believe that. Can you list them for me?" And he said, "I'll come back to you." And the answer is they're not offering full-time jobs in that vicinity, or almost none of them. Yeah. And it seems to be something that the councils cannot enforce. Once the permission has been given, then basically, job done. They've got away with it, and they don't actually deliver.
I think if that can be made a condition of the planning application and the consent, and then it's the responsibility of the local authority to ensure that that's happening and hold to account any developers that are not meeting what they've said that they will do and what's been consented within that planning application.
Did you have anything to add on that issue?
It's certainly, it's a huge issue, the housing. We see all the time that it's not just people growing up in the areas who cannot find affordable housing in order to stay, but when people are trying to employ people and bring people into the areas, and these are areas where depopulation and ageing population is a huge issue, that there isn't the housing to support those people's livelihoods. So anything that can improve that situation would be great, but I don't think that I can add much more to that.
Thank you. Both the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government have finished consultations on community benefits. And at the moment, it's £5,000 per megawatt just for onshore wind. It doesn't include anything for offshore wind, and it doesn't include anything for pumped storage, which, as we know, is going to become massive. The 5,000 figure was set in 2014 by the Scottish Government, and questions have asked. I have written to John Swinney asking for that guidance to be changed to 12,500, which is the Highland Council figure. I got a nondescript answer back, and we're still waiting for the Westminster Government to come up with their conclusion, although it was meant to happen late last year. Do you believe that we're going to end up with a position where proper community benefit can be delivered across all renewable sources, which can make a real difference to the economy of rural Scotland?
I would like to think that that's what we're going to say from that, and we fully support that £12,500 uplift from that original 2014 figure. You know, the fact that there's been no inflationary increase on that since that point in time is a critical element to us, hence why we've gone for that particular approach. I'd hope that we will see that increase is implemented, but I think the jury's out as to whether that is actually going to be put forward or not. And I suspect that the industry have got we would like to see it consistent across all technologies. I think that's fair to say, because, you know, as you've identified, hydro pump storage, you know, there's not a necessity to deliver anywhere near that. Some are, some aren't, and that's causing a little bit of angst and conflict, I think, between communities, particularly in Highland, where we've got one developer saying we're gonna meet what's the £5,000 per megawatt, and others that say no, they're not. So to have something that's mandated in a framework and everybody knows exactly what they're going to receive would be helpful from that perspective. But as I say, I'm not sure whether we will get to that position of £12,500, but it would be nice to think that we could.
And if all the developers were required to pay the same, do you believe it's affordable for the developers to pay, say, 5% of gross revenue, or £12,500, which is roughly the same, I think?
Thank you for your question. So I mentioned earlier about how wind farms have evolved over years, and I think when the £5,000 was originally introduced is when we had the renewables obligation. The cash profile was very different from what it looks like today. With the introduction of then the sort of CFD, our return rates have significantly reduced by almost by half, but the costs in terms of construction haven't decreased, and so our margins are much smaller. I think the caution I would express when it comes to it is that any 1-2 projects are entirely different, and so it's very hard to say whether one project should give more or another one, or whether there should be a standardised approach to this or not. So I was involved in 2 projects last year. One had a very simple construction, much higher up in the hill, very windy. That one could potentially shoulder something slightly different. The other one that I was involved in, there was trees to fell, it sat slightly lower down, the wind profile was very different from the other one as well. And I had to justify myself on a weekly basis on why that £5,000 should be adhered to, because the project was already so marginal. But it was important that we maintained that position. I ran some quick numbers to kind of demonstrate what this would look like. And I focused a little bit more in the northern part of Scotland, and I'll come back to that in a second on why. But increasing it to roughly sort of £7,500 is almost a difference of 1.2 percentage points. Increasing it to 12.5 is roughly about 3.6 percentage points across our portfolio in terms of what that increase of community benefit would look like. If we are already dealing with marginal investment opportunities, that could very quickly fall to something that's uninvestable. And I think for me is needing to reflect on what the overall objective is, what we're trying to do here. It's making sure that we are making sure that developers are adhering to bringing forward the best community benefit possible for these areas, but at the same time also bringing forward clean energy, which is the overall objective. And I think it's important to remember that we sit within a global context here as well. And Scotland is only one country, and there is money being sought after all around the world, and we still have to make Scotland an attractive place to invest in. I do what I do because I want to do right by the communities, and I get a little bit hot under the colour because I think it's such an important element as well. But I also sit in various boards where I have to justify what it is that we do, and I still have to make this an attractive investment proposition. So it's really important to highlight why these elements are so important and not come forward with such a substantial increase that then could debilitate projects potentially coming forward. The other issue that we do have, particularly in the Highlands, is this increase of grid charging around Tunos, in that it's incredibly volatile, and we are seeing a potential threefold increase in the future as well. And I think that means that those margins that we're talking about is getting much smaller. Just to finish off and bring it back around is, and this is a little bit harder to kind of put into words because I have one particular opinion, but when we come back to the whole mandating prospect, and I do believe that the £5,000 is an appropriate number, but we also have to encourage developers to do right. So in terms of what we do in Nadara, we host a whole additional activities. We do a call for projects, we have ESG funding, we help support students for training, we have 8 community ownership elements as well, which is more than any other developer in the country. So there's a whole host of opportunities above the £5,000, and I think if we focus too much on this, we take away the opportunity for developers to expand and really make sure that they bring some really beneficial opportunities for rural communities in Scotland.
But do you accept that many people are now saying, unless it's really, really worthwhile for us, we don't want it? So it may be that if you guys can't deliver the numbers, financial numbers that we need, then in fact it shouldn't go ahead anyway.
I think the point is absolutely fair. I think the world in which we now develop wind farms is entirely different. Our understanding of how a wind flows across a given site is entirely different. And historically, it was the case, 20 years ago, you were standing on top of a hill and say, this looks like a nice opportunity for a wind farm, let's pop in. And it was likely that you could make it financially attractive. That world now no longer exists. You have to focus very much on the cost profile much earlier on. Focus around what the grid charging will look like in the future. What is your wind looking like? And if that wind farm cannot sustain those costs, then there needs to be a very serious question on whether that's the right project to bring forward or not. And, I think you are beginning to see that, and particularly with the connections reform process. And you mentioned earlier about the intervention that we've seen last year up in the Highlands. It's that sense of overwhelmingness. There was 700 gigawatts of connections in the UK, and I do believe that hopefully we will see a sense of realisation that we can't pop a wind farm in every location as well.
Christine Sullivan.
This is a question for yourself, Gail. I think just picking up on some of the aspects that Finley mentioned there. Bigger Economics has suggested that the Highland Council Social Value Charter could actually reduce the number of onshore wind projects by 80%. What is your view on that?
We were initially shocked at the reaction, and I think it's fair to say that when we launched the Charter in June 2024, I think it was received by the sector quite negatively. And I think it's fair to say that we've been disappointed with the uptake of involvement from particular developers during that period of time. We strongly oppose that, just based on the fact that we believe that inflationary increase should have been there all along to get us to the position that we're in. I think the other element of the social value charter that we need to look at is that there are many other elements of that charter which the various different developers have alluded to already. So we're looking at a variety of different elements around housing to support depopulation, skills, training and development. And some of the £7,500 that we asked for to go into a strategic pot is to support those types of initiatives. So we've looked at area place plans, engaged with local communities to say, what do we need to do? What are our priorities? What do we need to change? And that's talking about infrastructure, transport, digital solutions. And actually, when we've engaged with some of the developers on a one-on-one basis, and we've explained in a little bit more detail what we're looking for in relation to that figure, they're already doing some of that work already. So actually, the £12,500 that we've looked at initially, although it was probably a shock to the sector, on a case-by-case basis, they've said, well, actually, we're already delivering some of that, so we can look at some of the elements of it that could fall within that £7,500 extra that we're looking for. What we're trying to do is say strategically across the whole of Highland, if each of the individual developers that are putting pots of money into different projects and different initiatives around apprenticeships, training, development, housing and everything else, if we pooled it all together into one strategic pot with a governance model that sits with private sector, public sector and communities, we could actually probably be more effective and more transformational in what we're trying to achieve. So we were very disappointed at the response that Bigger came back with, particularly in the fact that there was no discussion around it. It was just very much here's our opposition to the figures that you're proposing under the Charter, without any communication or discussion as to the rationale behind it.
So just picking up on that latter point, it sounds to me as if the £12,500 total figure was arrived at without prior engagement with the companies to have a better understanding of the wider contribution through training, apprenticeships, housing, the community wealth building elements. So do you believe there is scope now to move forward with a better, more holistic approach and having better engagement with the companies up front?
And that's what we're trying to do. So we're now trying to embed the social value charter process as early in the planning process with individual developers as we can. We've also started to have positive engagement with Scottish Renewables, and they, obviously as the representative body for a variety of different companies in the sector, we're looking at ways that we can operate and work with them around different solutions to try and help us achieve what we're trying to achieve. I think for me it's reassuring, and for the council it's reassuring that the majority of organisations agree in principle into what we're trying to achieve. It's in the facts and the figures and the numbers and the proportionality. And what we've tried to say is, yes, it's a blunt tool to start a negotiation, but we will have a communication on a case-by-case, development-by-development basis to see what can be achieved across the Charter. We're not looking for all 9 elements to be produced for every single development, but we're just looking for that meaningful engagement to look at what can be achieved from each individual development. Or collaboratively across numerous developments if they've got numerous developments in the area.
Just as an intervention, that figure
no,
of 12...
Mr MacDonald, no. Dave Dugan.
Thanks, Chair. Miss Logan and Mr Becks-Phelps, very quickly if we could, community engagement in your projects, how would you sort of very quickly summarise how you're seeking to drive them forward the best? And really, actually, what I want to understand is any sort of respectful frustration you have with the regulator, because I know fine well from my constituency that the regulator is responsible for setting the detail of or the framework into which developers for generation or infrastructure have to frame their community benefit prospectus. But often they're behind the curve. That would be my view. I don't want to get you to say difficult things about the regulator, obviously, but communities have an expectation. The regulator sets the framework, and you're in the middle trying to pull the strings together. How do you do that effectively and expeditiously?
I can start. So engagement, I've used the word a few times already this morning, the word flexibility. I cannot highlight enough how different every single community is. And you always have to have a framework, in terms of a policy position. I accept that. But when you go into a rural community that is hosting potentially something that they've never experienced before, it's how you have that meaningful engagement. And I think it's becoming really invested in what that looks like. So within our own individual company, we have employees that are based all around the UK, not in one specific city, but from the Highlands to the very south of Scotland as well. And having people that are actually sitting within these communities, it allows them to have a much more engaged conversation. When you begin to do that effectively, you begin to understand what that community actually wants out of this. And if you do that much earlier on, you are then able to evolve the community benefit and actually tie in some of those elements in terms of what the community would like out of it, whether it's social housing, whether it's fuel poverty, but actually you almost then use that application to facilitate some of those wider conversations. I think part of the issue in what we are seeing at the moment is that, and it's very commendable on what Labour is trying to achieve with Clean Power 2030, but it is introducing a bit of a rushed process as well, and we are taking away a little bit of that meaningful engagement. So part of your discussion is also about how we ensure developers are having meaningful engagement with their communities to ensure that it's tied back into their applications, but it's much easier said than done.
Okay. Ms. Logan?
And specifically in regard to the community benefit funding, we're very pleased that the regulator has accepted what has been put forward in the guidance and that we are being allowed to make those investments. And one of the very beneficial elements of that is that any funding available beyond the administration costs of the funds can also be invested in capacity building in local communities, which is sometimes a barrier for local projects being able to apply to funding in the past. So we're pleased that Ofgem has allowed that. And we work very closely in the development of these funds with local communities. We built our regional fund based on open consultation to identify the themes of people around skills and employability, place, which is mostly focused on culture and heritage, and also fuel poverty, because we recognise that that is a real challenge across the north of Scotland area. And then locally, the local panels are made up of local members, independently chaired, and we help inform the decisions on allocation of funding using things like local place plans, engagement with development trusts, community councils, and a wide range of people from the local area. And that helps us tailor those funds to the real needs of the local area. Take Peterhead, for example, in one of the lowest bands of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, and their place plan has a focus on supporting young people. Through our local North East Fund, we've been able to apply £200,000 to projects supporting young people, including £100,000 with Peterhead FC, to work in partnership with schools to increase motivation and attention at school.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. Ms Mitchell and Ms Anderton, maybe you could be a little bit more candid than commercial operators can be. Ofgem, it seems to a lot of people, wouldn't know a volt from a bolt. And when it comes to regulating, they are invariably on the back foot. This is especially important when it comes to community engagement, because communities start off from a position naturally of huge scepticism when some of these projects come down the line. And it should be abundantly clear to all communities that there are significant community benefits if this project gets greenlit. And whether they want it specifically on its own merits or not, if it does go ahead, there should be a clear benefit. In my constituency, I've got very mature community benefit funds from wind farms, and I've got community funds that are yet to be delivered from infrastructure. So I've got the full spectrum, and still people are hugely sceptical about what's going to benefit their communities and how. And that can't be just the fault of the developers. There has to be a role for the regulator that has failed to demonstrate what the benefits are of these investments. How can we change that dynamic from this clunky, pejorative, here's a little bit, here's a few crumbs off the table, but we'll tell you how to spend them, to actually empowering communities to benefit from what is in effect the common good that belongs to them, the land and the wind and the sun, to benefit.
We've got the gist of the question, so if you wouldn't mind giving us the answer now, thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think most of the communities that we work with, when they see wind turbines on the horizon, they can't really see any benefit at all, and they're probably living in fuel poverty as well. Yeah. And what they see is that the turbines are generating lots of revenue for somebody, but not for them. And indeed, they are paying some of the highest prices for electricity that there are in the whole of the UK, and suffer from the highest levels of fuel poverty as well, with almost 1 in every 2 households across northwest Scotland suffering from fuel poverty. And it's not just due to the kind of obvious things like the low incomes and the bad weather, the elderly demographics and so on. A lot of it is to do with the rurality because it's off gas. So people are having to pay for electricity to heat their homes, and the cost of electricity is now over 4 times as much as gas per kilowatt hour. So these people are suffering very, very badly, and yet they see, what they hear is quite cheap electricity being generated all around them on the hilltops. As far as community benefits are concerned, I think a regional approach is really useful to target fuel poverty, to deal with fuel poverty. And, for example, a model that we use at ALIEnergy is that there are a couple of community benefit funds that were set up a very long time ago, about 20 years ago in Argyll and Bute, when it was very early days for community benefit fund schemes and wind turbines. These were small, early wind farms. But there was a model set up by Argyll and Bute Council at the time whereby 60% of the community benefit fund would be kept by the local community in the usual way. 40% went to a regional tranche. And that regional tranche, which admittedly was quite small because these were small wind turbines, and these were in the days way, way before it was £5,000 per installed megawatt, came to ALIEnergy, and the rationale there is that energy-related revenues should help to address energy-related problems. So ALIEnergy can use it to address fuel poverty on a regional basis. ALIEnergy can use it also for energy-related education in schools and other community energy benefits. And those funds were linked to the lifespan of the wind turbines. And so we still benefit from those funds today. It's a legacy that has seen us through 20 years of ups and downs of short-term funding. And it's a bit like a bedrock on which the rest of the charity has been able to build and operate successfully.
I'm sorry. I don't want to cut you off, but I think one of the things, maybe because you've raised it, is that the actual revenue use of these funding is maybe not optimal, and that some of it should be invested into a trust and a legacy so that it becomes a dripping roast for a community in perpetuity rather than consumed on a revenue year-to-year basis. Is that something anyone's looking at? Over and above the example that you helpfully set out, Dr. Mitchell. Is anybody else looking at that?
Just quickly, I didn't, obviously we can only offer the benefit, but we work with a whole host of communities, and we are dealing with a different level of cash, and it was quite humbling to hear that. So you've got examples in Fort Augustus, for example, where they use a community benefit. I appreciate they receive slightly more because they've got a number of wind farms, but they use it to employ individuals, actually go out and find opportunities to invest. And I think more recently they built some social housing. I do know of communities that do put some of the community benefit into an endowment fund, for example, as well. I think it's really important to recognise here that the world is moving forward and the level of investment into these rural communities is now different. And the points that you raise are very genuine and opportunities. And I think we can definitely look at the different communities within Scotland to find out what is being done and actually develop something that works with these rural communities, because the opportunities is genuine and can be really exciting.
I have a couple of questions, so in the interest of time I'm going to wrap them up, and if I could just ask you to keep your answers succinct. So it's for Lynda and Finley, and it's around shared ownership arrangements. Can I ask how many groups have entered into such arrangements in Scotland, and what you view to be the main barriers preventing wider adoption of shared ownership, and also the policy measures that could perhaps remove some of those barriers and encourage more of these models to come forward, but ensuring that they deliver benefits for the whole of the community, not just those that wish to invest. I'll go to Finley first.
Yes, for sure. So within Nadara, we offer more shared ownership than any other developer in the country, to a grand total of 8, which feels like a very small number. And the reason it is a small number is because it's very, very complex. We have a number of different models that we operate, and again, I keep referring back to that word flexibility. I think it's a genuine opportunity. I've heard different percentages, up to 20%. Again, I think we have to be very cautious here in what we are mandating, but also working to what that community wants out of that project. I think that word empowerment is really important. So a community that actually sits behind where I live, Finley, and it's a wind farm that we operate. It's a really unique example. They pushed for wanting to have a sort of theoretical turbine equivalent. But the challenge always there is that for a developer, we have to build the wind farm. And I think for different funding mechanisms, a developer, doesn't necessarily can wait for the funding to come through from the community. So what happened in that instance was that the developer built out the entire wind farm and loaned that percentage back to the community, and they're now receiving, I think, in the regions of 400 to 500,000 pounds per year, and it's transformational in that area. So shared ownership there has been a real success story. But again, going back to how you bring that forward as a model across other communities is very challenging, because some communities do not have the ability to be able to do so. We mentioned already GB Energy. I think that's an interesting prospect and something that should potentially be explored further. One of the challenges is always going to be around timing. If you have an financial investment date in which you have to bring forward a particular project, and a conversation I actually had recently within our own board was actually saying, well, look, we have this opportunity. It's not actually in Scotland, it's in Wales, but it's saying, well, this is an opportunity we want to bring forward to the community, but actually I'm going to ask that we build out the wind farm, but the opportunity then is still present to the community. For a lot of developers, that's quite a tall ask to say that actually you pay for this, but that may not necessarily be yours in the future. Luckily for us, we operate at a scale where that is an opportunity to do so. But I think for us, we do it because we do genuinely believe in it. It's the right thing to do. The model has evolved a lot, and Zoe's point earlier was very fair, that the shared ownership model has evolved, and I think it needs to be focused on the community. But again, not one size fits all. But I think there are genuine opportunities for likes of GB Energy to be involved in this, but we need to focus around how do we build in that capacity for communities to be able to explore this opportunity, and how do we get the timings right for these projects as well.
Regarding numbers, maybe I could point you towards a data set, a database that's held by Local Energy Scotland, whereby they are looking at not only the ones that exist already, but the ones in the pipeline. I don't know the numbers off myself, but regarding the process, we're involved with a couple of shared ownership projects at the moment and have been going through quite a long process of community engagement with a couple of developers, and it's been really interesting to go through the process. Again, Local Energy Scotland has been really, really helpful in supporting us through the learning process. Local Energy Scotland, of course, administer the CARES grants, but they also offer a lot of advice and hand-holding to communities that are following this journey. We have found that we were able to go through the process of signing MOUs and that sort of thing, and then applying to CARES for legal advice and financial advice, which is really helpful as well, because there are so many different ways that you can take this forward. There are different legal structures, and it was helpful to us to understand the different legal structures right from a very early stage that could be potentially used. So we're at a stage now where we did a lot of work during 2024, community engagement work locally, bringing together community councils and all of the local community in an inclusive manner to make sure that everybody was happy with continuing to explore these options. The wind farms that we're involved with are still not through the planning permission stage, though, so we're at the stage now where we're kind of waiting for that to happen before we make a final decision on things like the legal structures that will be involved and putting those into place. Regarding the finances, I think that's quite an interesting one, because some members of the community are saying, well, we need to make the business case now. It is a bit early for us to make the business case, and indeed we don't have the information from the developers to enable us to do that at all at the moment. And I understand why. I mean, it's going to be probably at least 5 years before these things are built, and therefore a lot can happen in the supply chain and global finances and everything. So I think if we had detailed finances at this stage, I understand that they would be very much ballpark. So but that does mean we're kind of a little bit blind in terms of how the financial side of things will stack up eventually, but I don't know if there's an easy way around that.
Ms. MacDonald?
Just we've got last few minutes. I don't think anybody in this room would doubt the fact that community ownership, then shared ownership, and then finally one owned by a developer is the priority people would prefer for their communities. The legislation which is coming through from the Westminster government, it's indicating that will be legislated in 2029. Do you believe that is too late, and by then the industry will have effectively been built out? What do you think, Dr. Mitchell?
I don't suppose it will be completely too late. And I understand that it takes time to work through these processes to create legislation. Perhaps it would have been great to start this process earlier, but at least we are now thinking about it, so that's a good thing.
Gail, do you have anything to say?
I think that probably is a bit of a potentially too late, particularly when we're seeing the amount of opportunity and planning that's coming through Highland at the moment. If it's okay, just very quickly to say, Highland are exploring a shared investment model and the legal emphasis that would allow us to work with communities around shared ownership, particularly. But yeah, I think if it was earlier than that, that would be preferable.
The final question then would be, looking at everything overall, what would your assessment of Scotland's community energy sector's ability to access the grid be? And I suppose this is really to Ms Logan in a sense. What steps then does your organisation need to take to support grid connections for community energy projects in Scotland?
The North of Scotland already has a significant volume of generation connected at the distribution level, which is where up to now most community energy projects have connected. It means that at the point where distribution joins transmission, most of that is already exporting onto the grid. So the best thing we can do to get more community energy projects on the system is to build out the additional capacity that's required, and that's what we're doing with our Pathway to 2030 projects. Beyond that, we recognise that the cost of securitising some of these large grid projects is a barrier for community schemes that can struggle with financing that, and we've recommended to Ofgem that once projects are approved, those projects no longer have to be securitised by the connecting party. We're awaiting Ofgem's decision on that. We also took steps to increase the threshold that Zoe mentioned earlier for access to the system. Scotland has a more radial system. It's not so much of a meshed grid, which means increasing that connection without the necessary capacity could risk security of supply by overloading assets and would also push up constraint costs on consumer bills. So we have to strike the right balance on making sure we protect that technical requirement. So we wouldn't see that as an appropriate model for a policy support for community projects, but we are keeping it under review, and with increasing demand there will be opportunity to look at increasing that in the future. We've also made recommendations to Government and Ofgem on the designation of community energy projects as priority projects. We believe that the opportunity to do that is there now through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill and an Act now, and also through the connections reform process, so we have recommended that. And we think there is an opportunity for GB Energy to support community projects with access to affordable capital, which is one of their biggest barriers.
And do you think there are any issues about differentiating community energy as a category in the grid connection?
Right now there is, because we have an obligation to not discriminate between any project, so we cannot, as the network company, prioritise. But as I say, there is the mechanism there should Government and Ofgem decide to determine community projects as priority, then that would allow us to prioritise them as capacity becomes available.
Very interesting, Dave. Very briefly.
It is very brief, Ms Logan. I think you referenced the designation of community energy and the prioritisation of connection for community energy as two outstanding questions that you've got with Ofgem.
And Government. And
Government. Have you got any indication of when you might get a response to that inquiry from SSEN?
We have not.
Right, okay.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming this morning. It's again been a very interesting session, and thank you for being with us, all of the panellists, in terms of our time. We started about 5 minutes late today. We've ended 5 minutes late, so that's us on track, I suppose. But thank you for your forbearance there. And thank you again for your evidence. It's been very useful to us going forward. Thank you.